And welcome back. So we've got a special guest today. Instead of our shipper update section, we've got Craig Fuller here, founder and CEO of FreightWaves. And Craig, you know, you've written several articles over the past month, and you've gotten a little bit of feedback from the industry in the space. But just this morning, we saw GDP come in as a surprising retraction of 1.9% overall. What are your thoughts here? And tell us a little bit about why you were able to make this call and see this coming and kind of shock a lot of economists out there.
Well, look, it has been an interesting past really 2 months. So we originally started seeing the deterioration in the trucking market really start in that as March 9th was sort of the peak of volume. And you can actually see this on the chart right here, Zach, is we saw right here where volume sort of peaked on March 9th. You sort of had this sort of, it looked like a normalization of the market and a cooling. But what really caught me off guard and caught our analysts off guard was just how sharp that contraction was in volumes. And it was something unexpected. Being attuned to market developments, you sort of understand that in March is into the quarter. It's really the first month where the U.S. physical goods economy, the freight market wakes up. You know, produce season that's starting to really sort of, we'll go into produce season after that. You have gardening and supplies, but the market didn't operate the normal way. And so we made this call about first was a bloodbath because we predicted that there was an oversupply of capacity. It's 170,000 more dispatchable trucks in the market. We've been watching that for a long time, knew that if the market ever turned, it could be ugly for some carriers. And then the bigger question was, what is happening with the freight market? And we've seen a rapid deterioration in volumes. And so we wrote these things, and a lot of people came out and attacked it. And the reason I think they came out and attacked it is that the historical way that people use data is they look at government data and they analyze government data or lagging data to understand it. But with tender data, we actually have a high frequency, high fidelity look at overall physical economy in near real time. Within 24 hours, you know what's happening. So the call was controversial because it defied every economic forecast and every belief about the state of the US economy. Obviously, this was telling us exactly what now is showing up in the government reports.
I want to stick on that for a second because I totally feel this sentiment strongly with you. Now, a lot of people are going to criticize this data set and say that it hasn't been around long enough to have enough studies done to it to kind of validate, and then you have to wait for things to develop to make sure that you're making these calls accurately. What are your responses to people that would say this data set hasn't been around long enough and we don't know what it's actually telling us?
Well, I want to go back to 2020, back in April of 2020, and you can read what I wrote then, is about aggressive resurging of the market basically throughout that entire period through Q2 of 2020. I'm talking from April all the way through June. I was talking about a V-shaped recovery and an aggressive one. In fact, I was on Bloomberg TV, and they made the statement that I was the most bullish person they had on TV all month long. And this was June of 2020. We saw right here that the U.S. freight market was surging, not softly, but surging. And everybody around it, including some of our own analysts, were looking at it and saying, there is no way because of all these unemployment data. I remember debating you about this.
We debated it.
We debated it. We had Jason Miller on FreightWaves TV in July for our 3PL summit that said he believed that it was more likely that Michigan State would play football than the U.S. freight economy to accelerate. That is not what happened. We saw the U.S. freight economy accelerate. There's a lot of people who sort of speculated that the volumes and the increase in demand was short term. It was a sort of shuffling and reoptimization of freight networks. That wasn't what happened. Demand shot up because the U.S. federal government, the Treasury, and Congress pumped so much money into the economy, it overheated. And that's exactly what's happened over the past couple of years. And then all of a sudden, in the last 3 months, what we've seen is the Federal Reserve is starting to pull back that printing machine. They're starting to slow it down.
To stop sometime.
And as they've slowed it down, and as people have resumed their lives of going out and partying and going out to sporting events and going out into doing stuff outside the home, we've started to see consumer consumption of physical goods slow down. And it was much sharper than what most people believed would happen.
Yeah, I think the real big tell for me here is just how quickly the market turned. It was almost an overnight situation, and I don't think you can get that level of precision with a lot of the other data that's out there, right?
You can't. So one of the real challenges is trucking spot rates have been telling us the same thing about weakening freight conditions. You don't have to look at tender data to get that. The challenge of trucking spot data is you don't know whether it is what's actually the reasons it's taking place. So you don't know if it's an overheated freight market that's just cooling off. You don't know whether it's capacity coming in that's just basically adding a lot more capacity in the market and therefore impacting freight rates. And you don't know if it's a volume problem. And the problem of using spot data alone and using load board data is load board data, the load post, number of post ratio stuff, all it tells you is what's happening on the load board. It doesn't actually tell you what's happened to the physical market. Tender data tracks the contract freight market.
Right.
And it looks at both the volumes and the reactions to how carriers are responding to those demand cycles and those demand orders. And it is the most reliable way to look at it because it's clean, it's actual transaction data, and it will tell you whether there's a volume problem or a capacity situation. Now, what we're seeing is interesting is it very well may be that this contraction in volume has stabilized. We've seen stabilization really take place right here. And it very well may be that the reason spot rates are coming down is because capacity keeps coming into the market and sentiment is changing.
Well, I mean, I have a theory about this stabilization that I said earlier, was that I think that it's still a little bit of time for this market to catch up. We've fallen so rapidly. Tender rejection rates there's still some room there to drop. And so I think the market is still catching up. And this little flatlining here, there's still enough room for it to kind of fall.
Well, we haven't seen what China's going to do. We know those containers, the lack of volume is going to come out.
So you just wrote an article about this.
I did.
And kind of explain that. What do you think is going to happen here in the next couple of months?
Well, let's keep in mind that China has been on a lockdown. So this draconian approach to how they're trying to do the zero COVID policy. So what the Chinese official position has been for the past 2 years, really since the start of COVID, is they're going to completely shut down their economy and not let people come together and commingle to spread the virus. Right. And they've had this policy for 2 years. The West, we're talking about America and Europe, and largely most of the world has sort of said, hey, COVID is something we're just going to live with. We're going to ride it out. We now have we have vaccines and treatment. But the Chinese have reacted differently, and they've done this lockdown. So they've shut down what is about 50% of their economy. And I want you to keep in mind, we're talking about shutting down 50% of the Chinese economy. China is the portion of the economy that is manufacturing and production that we as American consumers depend on is a far greater degree than if we did the equivalent. So we're talking about that much of the economy shutting down. We're talking about probably 70, 80% of that is somehow tied into physical goods production. Right. So that means that goods are not being produced in China and they're not leaving China to the speed of which they were before. So we have introduced, or we're going to launch this just in a week, our high frequency ocean data that does a lot what we do around volume. It was something we've had for over 2 years, and we've been basically back testing it and building models. We're releasing it at the Future of Supply Chain in Northwest Arkansas, and what it has been telling us is that ocean bookings, in terms of bookings of containers, have dropped significantly by about 35% since these lockdowns started. And containers leaving China or scheduled to leave China to the United States have dropped by 50%. Now, I want you to keep in mind that Chinese goods represent approximately 16% of U.S. truckload volumes. So if you lose 50% of the volumes coming into the ports, then there is a potential to lose 8% of U.S. truckload demand during that period of time.
Right, so do you think that this is going to further compound what we're seeing in the market?
Absolutely, it has to. And the reason I think it will absolutely do it, we've seen this play out before. So if you go back to 2019, you actually don't have it on your chart. But what we saw in the pull forward back in 2019 was the very same thing played out. Was you go back to, if you remember in the pull forward, it was based on tariffs. So basically Donald Trump decided to declare a tariff war against China, implemented 10% tariffs in December, and then said, hey, if I don't get my way and you don't stop doing what I want you to do, then I'm going to implement a 25% tariff on Chinese goods. Well, it took a little bit longer than he said it, but anyways, those tariffs went into place. May 9th was the date, and because everyone was watching the signals from Washington and the signals from China, a lot of those companies brought products here to the US so they would avoid those tariffs. 25% was far more impactful. So we saw an acceleration of freight demand come into the United States to pre-stage before those tariffs. We call it the pull forward. Right. After those tariffs went into place, volumes dropped.
Right.
If you look at the outbound containers out of China, they dropped on April 6th, which was 7 days after that date that Donald Trump said that he was going to implement the tariffs. But on April 6th, they dropped by 28% from April 6th to and it takes about 35 days. So the challenge is
cycles.
Well, it takes a couple weeks. Yep. So in those days it was about 2.5 weeks. Today it's actually 27 days. Right. And so it takes a while for that freight to flow over to the United States and then to get into the system. It takes approximately 10 days to go from being offloaded off the ship to showing up on rail or trucking networks. So our data will show up in about 10 days. So what we believe is going to happen is very much like that, is sometime in about mid to late May. And now but there's a lot more inventory, there's a lot more containers stacked, so it could push into June. But I think sometime in mid-May, we're going to see a significant drop in volume in intermodal and in truck that comes from Southern California, because those containers are not going to flow into the ports like they did before. And that is going to significantly drop volume. And when we saw last time, the reason we know that it was the pull forward is that outbound volumes out of Southern California dropped equivalent to the percentage drop of containers that came out of China. So we know that the US freight market is going to lose a lot of volume just because Chinese goods are not flowing to the degree they were. And here's the problem. No one knows, and except maybe Premier Xi, when the Chinese economy will resume activity. And there are people that are geopolitical analysts that have suggested this could go on to June, and there are other people that believe that it will actually go on until October, until after the Chinese Congress, where they basically appoint Premier Xi for life, is sort of the joke, but that's effectively what he wants. And they believe that he will maintain this policy of zero lockdowns because in their mind, in the Chinese mind, the lockdowns are superior to the Western model of let it just go.
Well, we're not a lot different. we kind of think our way is better too.
We do. Of course, I mean, but like I think it's, are you willing to sacrifice? I mean, basically, China has locked their own people into cages, and they're not able to get out for grocery and food. It's a really, really, from a humanitarian standpoint, it's really egregious, and it's really sad. And the bigger impact for us as Americans isn't so much the human toll, which is really, really just flat out defies every bit of ethics and morality that you would ever want as a human. Sure. But the bigger issue for American consumers is that those products, those cheap goods that we're used to from China, and critical components that we use to build other products and assemble here in the United States, are not going to be flowing over to the degree. The problem is we don't know what those items are. So as an American consumer, what I would be really thinking about is that back to school, think about the goods that you buy for back to school, those are the very goods that are probably not going to be coming over in the volumes that they would otherwise be.
Back to school in August, man.
Back to school, because you think about it, if you shut off volumes in April, and you slow down in May, there's about a 60-day window. And we think about the next big sort of inventory restocking. You think about it usually 2 quarters ahead. It rolls August. 2 quarters ahead.
July, August.
Yeah, is that July, August is when the back to school happens, and those goods would have normally flowed in May into the United States, maybe as late as June, but probably not much further than that. that's the very period that's going to face disruption. So I told my wife, I've told other friends, is like, go ahead and stock up on back to school because you literally don't know if those goods are going to be there. The great thing is these are really easy today to get your hands on back to school goods. Just go ahead and stock up. Like, so you're not out of it. You can't, I mean, the textbooks are a little different, but we're talking about pencils and backpacks and the stuff that you want. I think they do. I mean, my kids use pencils, right? But just go ahead and stock up so you have them. The good news is there's so much inventory in the economy that largely a lot of the items will, if we sort of roll in, will be fine if China resumes. Now, the risk is if China doesn't resume its economy till October, if you sort of believe then we have major problems going into the holidays. But that is not something that I think anyone's ready to call right now. I think what we're looking at right now is the volume. But we do, I think you could clearly expect some volume drop in U.S. freight surface volume sometime this summer.
Right, so you're calling for a bottom over the summer, potentially? If...
I think bottom, and here's the great news for people that will ride this out, is that when China resumes, and I assume it will, like clearly it's going to, once it resumes, we will have the opposite effect of massive surges of volumes that very well could make this look like just a very small...
Like 2019?
Yeah, this could look like... So we could see a massive surge of volume as China resumes. And I think that's the most optimistic thing, but I think we got to ride out the storm before that.
Man, the pendulum swinging back and forth. Well, thanks so much, Craig, for all of those thoughts. A lot to digest here. We've still got a very volatile market, but we're going to toss it back over to Mike and Kaylee with our next guest.